So again, welcome to this first workshop for the semester for Thriving Academically in Seminary. This is a part of the Writing Center's initiative and Dr. Zari Riley's to make sure that whatever academic tools students need that may not be taught in the classroom, but you need them for the classroom, we're able to kind of give them out in some ways. And so today we're focusing particularly on how to read, navigating particularly the type of reading that happens in seminary. And so I've bulked this into three kind of sections. One is how can we read efficiently? Second is how can we read effectively? Third, how can we read in order to join the conversation? I think both of the first two are important because particularly with seminary reading, for a lot of people, this is the most amount of work, most amount of reading they've had to do in a long time, if ever before. So there's one task that is making sure we can get the reading done. Getting through the high number of pages. There's a second task, which is how to read effectively. Once one finishes all that reading, can one not just share a synthesis of what happened, but engage it at a different level so that we get to that third one, which is to join the conversation. So not just the comprehension of the reading, but how can we read effectively in such a way that we have something to offer and to contribute. And I titled this, Lord, Teach Us to Read, because I think reading is a skill that we are taught. It's not something that I think a lot of us, have been conditioned to think that when we graduated third or fourth grade and knew how to read, that meant reading was done. But reading, particularly academic texts, is a skill, and it's something that we learn how to do. So here's what I want those who are watching, or those, even if you're watching on the recording, I want you to take a moment and look at your syllabi, either physically, digitally, take a look at next week and just figure out the total number of pages. Look at every class, every assignment for what's required. If you have, classes that say this is recommended reading, you can leave that out if you want to. But for next week, what are the required number of pages you have to read? And I want you to think about what is the estimated completion time. So for you, if you have 85 pages, how long do you think it will take you to read 85 pages? So I'm actually going to give us a second. I'm going to turn off my screen. I'm actually going to do the same for what I have to read next week and just tally up what has to be done. Okay, hopefully by this point you have a number. You don't have to share it with me, or if you're watching this recording, just it's good to have the number to think about what do I have to do next week. And what I encourage you to do, and this works especially since today's a Friday, each week before, it's helpful to just go ahead and look at what do you have to do. With syllabi, particularly with 3 or 4 classes, it can be really easy the day of or the week of to just look at the syllabus for the first time and then to realize, oh, I actually have to read 60 pages for this class by tomorrow. And so if we're able to just one simple step, but at the end of one week, just take a glance. You don't have to do any of the work yet, but take a glance to see what is on my agenda for next week and how long do I think it's going to take me. What I want you to do then is, based upon the readings that you have for next week, again, this is just for you, place them in order of your interest. Out of those classes, we can tell the truth. Some of them are more engaging to us than others. Some of them align more with our interests or with our passions or with our vocation. So, what are those? How would you rank them in terms of the readings that you think are interesting? And while you're doing that, think about what to you are the markers of an engaging text. So, are you interested because the subject material, or are you interested because you enjoy the way this particular author writes? Are you interested about the content? What about it is exciting to you or is interesting to you? And I'll give us another 2 or 3 minutes to do that with our readings for next week. Okay. As you're coming back, when you, even for those of you watching the recording, I want you at some point between now and when you start reading for next week to think about the order in which you want to read things. I'm about to shift, in the workshop, how we can read and kind of being taught what helps us read best. But one thing I think helps us is determining. It's just like with household chores or errands. There are the things we really want to do and the things we do not. And sometimes we just have to bite the bullet and do the thing we don't want to do first to get it out of the way. That's how some of us operate. For others, we want to do the easy things first or the things we enjoy first and save that one that we don't like as much for last. However that works for you, do that with your reading. Structure it to where I'm going to enjoy this reading more than the other, and place them in the order that's going to be helpful to you. So I'm going to read this passage from the Gospel of Luke. Says he was praying, he being Jesus, was praying in a certain place. And after he had finished, one of his disciples said to him, "Lord, teach us to pray, as John taught his disciples." And he, being Jesus, said to them, "Suppose one of you has a friend, and you go to him at midnight and say to him, 'Friend, lend me 3 loaves of bread, for a friend of mine has arrived, and I have nothing to set before him.' And he answers from within, 'Do not bother me. The door has already been locked, and my children are with me in bed. I cannot get up and give you anything.' I tell you, even though he will not get up and give him anything because he is his friend, at least because of his persistence, he will get up and give him whatever he needs. So I say to you, ask and it will be given, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened for you." And that's from the New Revised Standard Version. I've centered this passage for the workshop because of 2 reasons. One is the title, right? Lord, teach us to pray, that there is something that we have to learn. It does not come naturally, even for colleagues or peers of yours who it looks like they're doing it naturally. They're not. They have learned how to read these academic texts. They have learned how to read them quickly. They have learned how to read them and extract the information. So part of it is the tool of reading. But the other part is that reading is about persistence. So even with a particular text, if it's difficult, if there is an argument being made that you don't understand, you have to just read it again. You have to just return to it. And similarly, I've experienced and believe when we just are persistent with the text, when we are treating it, when we're being the annoying neighbor to the text, it will eventually make sense to us. It will eventually get to us. But we can't read it once, say we don't understand it, and then forget it. We really have to keep knocking, keep trying to understand it, and then eventually we'll understand the argument and be able to engage the conversation. So these are things I want you to think about, and then I'm not going to stop for this, but think about this. How do you currently read? And I do mean how. How are you sitting? Where are you reading? Do you have noise in the background? Are you reading digitally, or are you reading a hard copy book? Are you reading around other people? Not just peers, but I mean, do you have a spouse or children or parents or friends that are around you? And when do you read? What part of the day works best for you? What part of the day do you realize you think you're going to read, and every time at that part of the day, you just don't read? For me, I want so badly to be a morning person. I convince myself every day that I'm going to wake up at 7 and I'm going to start reading and writing, and I'll have so much done by noon. And then I'll end my day at 3 or 4 o'clock. And day by day, I fail until finally I said to myself, you are just not a morning person. You don't get work done in the morning. It's better for me to start my work around 11 or 12 and work until 6. But all of those factors about how, where, and when you read are important because all of us are going to do it differently. And so you have to find what works for you. Now, there are 2 techniques that I want to introduce today or share. These you may have heard about, but perhaps not in this context. The first is what's called the Pomodoro Technique. You see the tomato and the Pomodoro, and it's named that way because this was actually, the original technique was taken from a chef who would use a kitchen timer to time out certain tasks. But it's a way for you to take a longer task or a bigger task and break it up. So whatever number you looked at for next week's reading, if it's 100 pages, that looks like a lot. It's daunting. But if we're able to kind of condense it and say, what I really have to do is read 25 pages 4 times. It's 100, but I don't want to sit down at a desk and thinking I have to read right now 100 pages. So one way to do this is to literally use your phone or something, or another timer, but decide what you're going to read and say, I'm going to read for the next 25 minutes. Or for some people, they find it easier to go kind of by the book's demarcation. So I'm going to read until I finish this next chapter. We're going to read this whole chapter. Whatever that is for you, if it's a certain time limit or if it's a page number, etc. When you hit that, get up. You may feel like it's going to be easier to just keep plowing through, but eventually you're going to run out of steam. So when you hit 25 minutes, 30 minutes, or you hit the end of the chapter, force yourself to take a break. So say you're reading 100 pages and you want to do this within 2 or 3 hours, however long it may take you. You can do this over and over again. Read for 25 or 30 minutes, take a 5-minute break, come back and read for another 25, 30 minutes, take a 5-minute break. And then if you're doing it for a long period of time, after you've done it maybe 4 times, that's when you want to give yourself even longer break. So you've done 24 kind of 25-minute intervals, and then take a 30-minute break. Watch an episode of TV, go on a walk, make sure you make your lunch or, feed yourself. Take a longer break, allow your mind to go to something else. And that way, when that break is done, you come back again and you're still just in the same pattern, right? I'm reading for the next 25 or 30 minutes. I'm only reading to the end of this chapter. Breaking this down does 2 things. One, it makes it more manageable for you as you're looking at what you have to read across different classes. This is different than, if you're reading a novel for pleasure and you're not in school, but you have 4 or 5 classes, each of which have reading loads. And it's easier to just break those up rather than, again, looking at it all on the table at once. The second thing it does, though, is what we don't realize, and what we're really not taught even, is that we are still working in those breaks. Our brains, our minds are still processing information even when we're not actively reading. So if we allow ourselves the time to actually breathe, we allow ourselves a break from the book just for 5 minutes, or just, in the larger break for 20 or 30 minutes, stuff starts to sink in and to process and to register at a different level. And that's kind of, that's going back to what I was saying about the persistence, is I can get super frustrated with the text that I'm not understanding. But if I just plow and dig even deeper into the text in that moment out of frustration, I'm probably not going to understand it. It's still going to be unclear. But if I'm getting frustrated with the text, if an argument still isn't making sense, I can allow myself the space to step away, to take a breath. And then maybe while I'm washing the dishes or on a walk, it will click. Something will make sense from the reading that wasn't making sense when I was right in front of the text. But it may make sense when my hands are busy doing something else, or when my mind is doing something else. I emphasize this particularly for seminary students because so much of what we do in theological education is embodied. We think not just about scholarly text, but we think about the actions in the world, and we think about the life of the church. So we want to make sure we are engaging all of our body while we're reading, and to not get stuck in the mind too much, because it won't help us. That's one technique. The second technique, or that's the technique, for reading efficiently. The second thing that we want to aim to do is to read effectively. And for reading effectively, I think there are three purposes, and these are ones that I kind of already mentioned, but a little bit more clear here. The first task of reading effectively is to engage the author and their argument. Solely, I'm just going to use the book I have in front of me. This is a book by Shandon Reddy. So what I care about when I'm reading this text is, what does Shandon Reddy say? What is Shandon Reddy's argument? What is it that Shandon Reddy is trying to communicate and trying to convince me, the reader, of? And it's helpful for us, firstly, to take Shandon Reddy, or take whatever text you're reading, at its own terms, for its own value. Read the author as the author. That's the first thing. The second task then is when we turn and engage ourselves and our own ideas. So I can read this whole book. I'm not saying that we should not be, critical, or should not have feedback to the book, but we cannot offer feedback to the argument if we're not first clear on what the argument is. If we have determined in our own head, because of a bias, because of a subjective, because of a misreading, if we've made up in our mind what their argument is, and we are trying to then combat that false argument, we're not actually engaging with what Shandon Reddy said, right? So the first step is to say, what is he or she or they saying? And then the second step is to take my own thoughts, my experiences, my other knowledge about the world and about the subject, informed knowledge, and engage my ideas. What do I think about what Shandon Reddy is saying? Does it make sense to me, or do I have questions? Maybe it makes sense, but I disagree, or I see it through a different lens, or I have another perspective that I don't think is being brought up by this author, right? But again, step two comes after the first step. In order to know your ideas about the author and about the argument, you first have to know the author and you have to know their argument. And then these combine in the third task of reading effectively, which is that we're reading to join a conversation of both thinkers and practitioners. And we want, particularly within seminary, our task is then to take these texts that we're reading in our classrooms and make them even broader, to bring more people into the conversation, whether that's through our preaching or through our pastoral care, through our work in chaplaincy, etc. We then want to translate what we're learning through this argument and share it with others, so that they can understand it too, and that they can be a part of the conversation. So I'm going to recap these one more time. The first is making sure we know what the author is saying. As we're reading, we want to do that. Secondly, and you can do this as you're reading or afterwards, it'll probably end up being a mix of both, is to engage your ideas. I say a mix of both because certainly as we're reading sentence by sentence and paragraph by paragraph, we have thoughts on that particular sentence or that particular paragraph, but we want to give ourselves space to get to the end, right? If we assume in chapter 2, we know what chapter 5 is going to say, then we don't give chapter 5 a fair shake. So we can have our thoughts, but we want to just suspend them until we've finished it, until we get the whole argument, because maybe there's something that we think they need to address, and they're going to address it, in 20 pages. And then thirdly, we're doing this so that we can join this conversation, that we can have take part as thinkers. The best way, this is the technique to me of reading effectively, is what is called talking to the text. Talking to the text. This sounds, or it may sound silly, but I've found to be effective, and others I have shared it with also found it to be effective. And it's simple. Again, this is not just, what does I want to say? This is not an inanimate object, although it is, right? It's a book. It has pages and words, but someone is behind this, right? A person, an individual with their own interests, with their own motivations, with their own experience, education, etc. They wrote this book. And so as much as I'm engaging with a book, I'm really also engaging with the author. I'm engaging with what the author has gifted to me by way of a book. And so that's why when I'm thinking about books, and this is particularly helpful when we're thinking about seminary texts, particularly history ones or others like that, where it can seem kind of really objective, where it seems really unmoored from an individual, that even a religious history book is a book written by an author or maybe two authors. And we want to engage them as authors. What are they saying? Every book has an argument. Even history books, there's a certain way they have laid out the history to achieve a certain end, right? There's still a motivation there. So we're thinking of this as a person, or this is the technique, right? Imagine you and this author. So for this book, Shandon Reddy, I'm going to imagine while I'm reading this book that Shandon Reddy and I are sitting down over coffee. That's it. We're sitting down at a table over coffee, and they are sharing with me their ideas. They're just talking to me. Now, the reason that we call it talking to the text is because if we're having coffee with somebody, they are not just unloading everything at us without us responding, right? It's a conversation. It goes two ways. And so it's helpful for us then to start thinking about our reading as a two-way conversation. So if I'm reading this text as if Shandon is talking to me, I'm going to talk back. What questions do I have for clarity? Where do I agree with their argument? Do I have pushback? Do I have critique? Is something connecting in my mind to something else over here? Whatever the conversation may be, I'm going to do that in the text while I'm reading it. I'm going to try to hold up. Let me find a good page. So in the margins, even of this text, right, I'm making comments back to Shandon Reddy. He's making a claim here, and I put a question off to the side. Whereas on this page, he has made a claim, and I put absolutely, and then I expound upon why I agree with him. So I'm doing that on every page that I'm reading. I'm engaging it like a conversation, so that when I finish reading it, I have not just been blown away by a fire hydrant, taking in everything, but I've engaged it. So if you ask me if you ask me about this book, in my mind, you're asking me, what did Shandon and I talk about? You're asking me about the conversation. And the book is just in place of the author, but it's still this conversation. I think some tactics for this, number one is you want to do a close reading and an annotated version of the coffee conversation. So whatever you're thinking, make note of it. Put it in your head. Don't just keep it in your head. Write it down. Make an annotated version of your first thoughts. I say this because even if you want to, and this happens to me all the time, I will read something and say, I'm not so sure about this. right? But I'm still suspending myself, waiting till I read the whole argument. And then maybe 5 pages later, they clear it up for me. So I don't go back then to the 5 pages previously and erase where I said, I'm not getting this. I, in the next part, put, oh, okay, I get it now, right? I want to annotate exactly what I'm thinking as I'm engaging with this author, just so it's a conversation. It flows that way. And then I'm able, when I go back to look at my text for class or to read it again for myself, I'm able to say, oh, yeah, on page 98, I wasn't exactly sure what they were doing, and I didn't understand it until page 95, right? However that works for you and whatever annotating looks like for you, make notes about what you're thinking while you're reading it. And again, you're having a conversation. So this can be thoughts, it can be ideas, it can be questions, comments, light bulbs, ahas, whatever is helpful for you and however you would naturally talk to anybody. And all of us will end up having our own annotation style. So I'm looking through my book to show an example. One of my ticks I have found is the word sure. So if they made a point that, I don't know if I can see that. If they make a point that I agree with, but I'm still kind of waiting to hear the rest of the argument, I'll just write sure, as if I was in person and they're saying something, I'm like, okay, sure, that makes sense. And then when they keep talking, if it's still something I'm following, I'll say, yep, sure, makes sense. And then when they get to their big aha moment, I might write there, oh, okay, yeah, you're tying it all together now. And that makes me also think about this other thing. So whatever it is. And then there's other points where I disagree and I'll put in the comments, I'm not so sure, or I may have taken that a different way. But it allows me then to engage the text with my thoughts. So we're going back to those 3 tasks, right? To know the author's argument, to know what we're thinking about it, and then to join the conversation. The last technique, or the last tip I have in this technique, is to think about your annotation. I don't want to use the word sparingly because I don't want you, it's not sparingly, but you want to do it intentionally. So I see a lot of students who I've met with who will show me, we're talking about reading, and so they'll show me the book they've just read, but they're still not understanding. But when I open the book, if there's 6 paragraphs between these 2 pages, 4 of the paragraphs might be entirely highlighted. So it's just all yellow. And I always ask, why is all of this highlighted? And to them, it's, this just seems like the big point. This all seems important. And not that any words or phrases or texts in a book are not important, but it's kind of what we say about a lot of things, right? If everything is important, then nothing is important. If we're highlighting everything, and if everything is the big point, and if everything is crucial to the argument, then we actually don't have any particular thing we can point to that's crucial to the argument or that's important, because we think everything's important. So we have to think intentionally, even as we're annotating, to decide, and I don't highlight at all. So, I mean, this is not me, trying to get you to do what I do, but I don't use a highlighter at all. If I think of a sentence or sentences are important, I will underline them and maybe put an asterisk by it. Or more often than not, I'm going to underline it and then still in the margin, put a comment, even if it's sure or yes, or I don't know. This text here, I don't know if you can see it, all of these 3 sentences here are highlighted, and in the margin, I just put the word yes with 2 exclamation points. But that way, when I go back, nothing else on these 2 pages is marked. So I'm not thinking everything's important. I know on this page, this is important. And then the other tactic I have adopted, even just in the past year, as I'm still learning to read and finding different ways to read, is I started buying these little sticky tabs to be able to quick reference back to a book. But again, if every page has a sticky tab on it, then there's no point, because we would have to then just sift through every tab to find out where we were, what the important things were, which is no different than turning through every page. So this book is 290 pages. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And there are 12 sticky tabs in my book. So for me, I can mark, I can underline, I can, put comments on all the pages where I have thoughts, but the things that are absolutely crucial to the argument, the point that I don't want to miss, or the points of synthesis where I think this is exactly what the author wants us to get from this, that's where I'm going to put a sticky note. It may be, for instance, thinking about a thesis, right? If I'm reading each chapter, if I find the thesis of that chapter or one of the theses of that chapter, I think this is what the chapter is about, I'm going to put a sticky note. That way, when I come back to this book, either for my own study or if I'm in class talking about it with colleagues, I don't have to look everywhere for my notes. I don't have to look about what I thought. I can say, yep, I have a sticky tab on page 25 because that's the main argument of that chapter. Again, underline or engage or highlight, whatever your method is, just do what is necessary. Be very intentional about it. So that way you're helping yourself, you're helping your later self out. That when you return to the text, you're not lost. This is particularly helpful for those of us who are in school, particularly seminary, because again, you're reading maybe 3 or 4 different writers in one week. So all of that is going to blur together. And sometimes you think it was in the pastoral care book, but it was really something you read in your preaching class, and all of it just blurs. Being able to refer back to your books and refer back to your articles is what you're trained to do. You don't have to have it memorized. What you want to do is know how to use your resources wisely. So I want to be able to go back to this book and remember, even if I just look at the 12 pages where I have sticky tabs, I would be able to tell you what the whole book is about just by looking at these sticky tab pages. It would sum it up for me, and I don't have to try to reread the book. So this is a passage. This is not an academic text per se. This is from Looking Around by Anne Lamott. But it's a sample text. It's just 2 paragraphs, or really 2.5 kind of. But I'm going to read it out loud. And while I'm reading it, it's even for you watching the recording, think about in your head, since you don't have it in front of you, think about what you would mark. Think about how you would annotate even these 2 paragraphs. So I'm going to read it. Obviously, it's harder by far to look at yourself with this same sense of compassionate detachment. Practice helps. As with exercise, you may be sore for the first few days, but then you'll get a little bit better at it every day. I'm learning slowly to bring my crazy pinball machine mind back to this place of friendly detachment toward myself, so I can look out at the world and see all those other things with respect. Try looking at your mind as a wayward puppy that you're trying to paper train. You don't drop kick a puppy into the neighbor's yard every time it piddles on the floor. You just keep bringing it back to the newspaper. So I keep trying gently to bring my mind back to what is really there to be seen, maybe to be seen and noted with a kind of reverence. Because if I don't learn to do this, I think I'll keep getting things wrong. I honestly think in order to be a writer, you have to learn to be reverent. If not, why are you writing? Why are you here? Let's think of reverence as awe, as presence in and openness to the world. The alternative is that we stultify, we shut down. Think of those times when you've read prose or poetry that is presented in such a way that you have a fleeting sense of being startled by beauty or insight, by a glimpse into someone's soul. All of a sudden, everything seems to fit together, etc. Talking to the text then would be me. I'm just going to give my example, and then if you want, pause this and take your own kind of break to think about how you would annotate it. Cindy in the chat says, bring my mind back to what is really there to be seen. Absolutely, right? We want to be able to lock in, and we just read 2 paragraphs and a sentence, right? So we can read all of it word by word, but we can also glance at it and say, the first sentence, compassionate detachment. If I'm reading, I might circle those 2 words, not the whole sentence. I might just circle compassionate detachment. That's what she's talking about. But then she gives us anecdotes, right? I don't need to know those. Drop kicking a puppy into the neighbor's yard, pinball machine mind, right? She's just giving further detail to the point, which is bringing our minds back to what's there to be seen. So then when I get to that last sentence, right? So I keep trying to gently to bring my mind back to what is really there to be seen. That might be a sentence I underline. or I might draw an arrow to it, or a star, or an asterisk, or whatever, right? That's the point. How do we do that? She's saying by being reverent. So then in that next paragraph, or even in that same sentence with a kind of reverence, but even at the top of the bottom paragraph, let's think of reverence as awe, as presence in and openness to the world. Same thing. That might be a line that I point an arrow toward or underline or circle reverence as awe. But that's it. I don't need to underline and annotate the rest of that paragraph because she's explaining, she's giving further detail to what she means by reference. So this is a small example, but try to take this technique to all of your texts. Be able to quickly identify what's the point that they're trying to get here, and then what's the fluff. Not that it's not needed, right? That's what makes good writing, is that we have a story that we're engaged in. So we're going to remember this narrative about drop kicking a puppy or about this pinball machine mind, but that's not going to help us if someone asks us what Anne Lamott was talking about. We don't want to say she was talking about drop kicking a puppy because that's not what she was talking about. And then again, when we annotate, it helps us for when we go back. So we wouldn't have to read this whole 2 paragraphs again. We would see the words we circled and we would see the words we underlined or drew an arrow toward or whatever, and would say, oh yeah, this page, she was talking about bringing our mind back, being reverence toward things to see them. And that's it. And then we move on. Here's what I want you to do as we wrap up. For a few moments, and I'm going to give you the space, I want you to jot down how you hope to accomplish all of your reading next week. So go back to what we did at the beginning, look at your pages, the number of pages you have, and then look at what order you put them in terms of your interest. So make a plan right now. How are you going to do all your reading next week? When are you going to do it? Where are you going to do it? How long are you going to do it for each day, etc. And then try to make down a plan, to jot down a plan for how you're going to read for engagement. So this week, while doing this reading, I'm going to try blank. I'm going to try talking to the text, or I'm going to try the Pomodoro method. Whatever it is, give yourself some accountability. Provide yourself the opportunity for accountability. And we'll take about 2 or 3 minutes to do that. And again, I'm going to do it too, because I have reading next week and a lot of it. So I'm also going to jot down how I plan to do it and what techniques I'm going to do so I can make sure it's done well. All right, coming back, and I'm going to read something that Cindy said in the chat, which is, we'll definitely talk to the text. Love that. And make notes in the margins. I need to give my highlighter a break. Yes, give the highlighters a break. They work hard. And again, everybody is different. So I have colleagues who annotate with highlighters almost exclusively. And there's not one right or wrong way. It's what works for you. So what I want you to do this week, though, as I'm encouraging you, is to try reading a week without a highlighter, or try reading a week where you write in the margins, and just see if it makes a difference for you. And if it doesn't, try something else or go back to what you were doing. Play with it as you're learning. Just like we learn any other skill, it's a lot of trial and error. And so the same is true with reading. As I said, these sticky tabs, I just started doing about this time last year. So my entire time when I was in seminary and the first 2 years of my PhD program, I wasn't using sticky tabs. It was something I tried, and then I thought, oh wow, this really works for me. So now I do it. And at one point, I was using a highlighter to highlight big passages until I tried something else and said, oh, I remember what I'm reading now, or I'm able to recall my conversation with the author now, rather than kind of looking at big swaths and big paragraphs, thinking I have to remember all of this. So just try, just experiment. And then if you want, I really do encourage you, let me know how it goes. Send me an email and let me know what's working for you or what's not. Let me know if you want other ideas. There's a lot of other techniques, a lot of other reading tools that are out there. So if you want other techniques, let me know and I can share some others with you. But if you have any other questions, feel free to email me, reach out. Best luck for your reading next week. And enjoy the recording. See you guys soon.
Bye.
Indeed. Thanks for coming.